Hi, in this video we are going to cover a little bit more about the basics of Java classes, and some of those things that we're going to talk about include things such as required methods, things that we always want to include when we're writing our own classes. So first, let's look at comparisons. When we're comparing objects using the equals equals operator, this is going to compare the reference or the hash of the object and not the actual values. So this is really important to remember because when we're comparing objects, we usually want to compare it on specific data types. So this could be an ID field or some other aspect that we're going to determine whether or not these two things are the same. For example, if we have two shapes, let's say we have a circle and we have another circle, and we want to know if these are the same type of circle, the same size or the same color maybe, it doesn't really matter. Whatever you want to compare on, we have to replace this equals equals operator with something else. And I told you before, we can't do we can't do operator overloading. Instead, what we do is we write an equals method. All right. So what's important about this equals equals operator, we can't compare objects this way. This is also true for things like strings. You want to make sure you're using a dot equals method when you're comparing your strings. So to compare object values, you need to create an equals method, and you can see a little bit more about what that looks like and why we do that on page 202 of your textbook. And typically it looks something like public boolean equals your class name and an O, which stands for other, as in the other object. And this is just a method that you describe and define in your class. So we do this again so we can compare on certain data values that we think are important for determining whether or not these two objects are actually the same. One way that we might do this is, let's say that we have two shapes, and let's say our shapes have a size, let's say they're circles, so they have a circumference or a diameter, um, and then they have maybe a color. Now, they might technically be two different objects because we wanted to be able to manipulate them differently, but perhaps we want to say that they are the same, they are equal to each other if their size and color match. So we might check the circumference or diameter of each and also the color and see if they are the same object, which again, this is not actually seeing if they are the same object because objects have reference values, which are their hash, but we're checking to see if their data is the same. Now, the other method that we need to make sure to include in every single class that we create is a toString method. This is what happens. This is the method that gets automatically called when you try to print out an object. So this is used to print the object's values that we think are important to be printed out by default by whatever calls our object. So by default, this will print an object's hash or reference number. And again, that's not really useful. We can't really make use of that as people, like programs obviously make use of that kind of information, but we can't really make use of it ourselves. So when we want to replace this with something that actually prints out reasonable data, you want to make sure to use and define a method such as public string toString in order to make sure that it returns a string that is actually valuable to what represents your object. Another method that you tend to want to include, and you don't technically need to include it every time because one gets defaultly made, is a constructor. Now, constructor is the method that creates an object when you use that new keyword when you're creating an object. Now, it allows you to set initial values, allows you to set up the object. It also allows you to pass in parameters for the particular values you're setting for your object. You always need at least one, the default constructor. If you don't define one, this will automatically be included for you. But if you include any other constructor, then this isn't going to be included by default. It won't be defined. So we will go over what that looks like with an example, but a few more things that are important about constructors. If you make note that the constructor is public and then the class name, there's no return type there, right? So constructors don't have a return type, and they always have the same name as the class that they're in. They can be private, and they can invoke other constructors, which can be very useful. And they can be called implicitly, they are called implicitly, I should say, when creating an object using that new keyword. So next I'm going to show you an example of writing a class. We'll go over the access modifiers and the getters and setters that I mentioned, and we'll also go over the constructors and what those look like.